Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Can everybody hear me? Okay, excellent. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah alamin wa afdalu salatu wa tamu taslim ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Hamza, just keep me updated on WhatsApp if you think changes or if something goes out of this. Inshallah, today's discourse is quite an important one. I've been thinking about delivering this for a while or talking about the topic. And but the problem was, what prevented me previously was it's a kind of a very big topic and it's difficult to kind of contain within 45-50 minutes. So I will try my best to introduce the topic, and what I decided is that any kind of subtopics related to this I will just cover in their own independent or separate discourses, inshallah. Now I've titled it quite interestingly, Demystifying Spirituality. And the reason for that is because spirituality is a kind of is mixed up with this concept of mysticism, and mysticism is quite a problematic term actually overall. Yeah, because it has, that particular word has particular inferences. So what I want to begin with is this idea of what spirituality is. I want to introduce the idea, and then I want to build from that, because terms are very, very important. How we use terms, without understanding the terms that we use, it's very difficult to have a kind of a meaningful discussion on them. So what does spirituality mean to anybody, really? To me, to you, may mean different things, and that's what I want to begin with. Spirituality means different things to different people. The Western tradition, especially currently. Okay, can everybody hear me? I'll double check, but somebody said they can't hear anything. You can hear me. Okay, that's fine then. So in the West, spirituality currently is seen as a particular thing. I want to get to that in a short while. But spirituality will be in reference. Okay, it's too low. Is that any better for everybody? I don't know if that changed anything. It seems to be. It's fine for me on my side anyway. But I'm not listening to myself, so. Okay. To continue that, spirituality generally is in relation not to the body but the soul. That's a foundational idea that we will accept. That even if some people don't accept the concept of a soul, meaning people that don't adhere to Islam anyway, or other religions, they will accept that the spiritual element of the human being, that there's a part of the human being that's metaphysical to a degree, that you can't touch it, but you can feel it, and it's the inner workings essentially. Now, for us as Muslims, what does spirituality generally mean to us? Well, we can kind of agree that spirituality to me and you would mean, other than physical actions, things like intentions, things like experience, how we experience particular things, and how we understand those experiences to be. But for believers, it's generally the idea of what affects the soul, something that's the kind of the invisible realm, the realm that can't be seen. And things that relate to that are more to do with spirituality. It's to do directly with the spirit or the ruh, or matters concerning the soul. So you could kind of loosely define it as matters concerning the soul. In Islamic literature, there are an array of words that are used for spirituality, and unfortunately, this is what I want to firstly unpack or deconstruct a little bit. That what is spirituality in Islam? So we have words like tasawwuf, for instance. Is tasawwuf spirituality? Is tazkiyah spirituality? Is that the word for it? Tazkiyah means to purify. Are these kind of? Then we have other words like zuhud. is zuhud spirituality. Zuhud is abstinence, to kind of disconnect from something or to abstain from it. Is that spirituality? So all these words kind of, or certain people have monopolized those words. And that's something incredibly important. So I want to begin with this idea of tasawwuf and what does it mean, and is it real? Was that term used by early Muslims? First and foremost, that there's enough literature on it for people to go and read where this word tasawwuf comes from. But the current use of the word, if we kind of talk about tasawwuf, it has been to a degree kind of owned and by particular groups and monopolized as well. And they use it to attack other people, like we're people of tasawwuf and they're people of not people of tasawwuf. And unfortunately, it's been completely misused. First and foremost, the word tasawwuf, where it comes from, is debatable anyway. Some say it comes from the idea of suf, that kind of these wool-wearing early people, Muslims that would wear wool and abstain from the world. And the kind of term came from that. Others differ with that, where the term came from. But what I want to look at is how we use it now. And unfortunately, it's a group-based term. You know, certain groups from traditional Islam will use that word tasawwuf to mean something very specific. But I want to kind of today do away with the terms and look at the kind of what's inferred by spirituality as without using terms like tasawwuf or tazkiyah, or because every group will use the term differently, and every group will claim to own that term. What we can't deny, and plus the term is tainted to a degree as well, and I just quickly explain that. Take the word Sufi. Now the word Sufi now, considering the early scholars, you know, people who wrote biographies about them would put the term Sufi at the end of their kind of end of their names, in a praiseworthy way, not in a negative way. Imam al-Dhahabi, was not early, but he's one of the great scholars who compiled kind of biographies of people. He would put that title after certain people as Zahid or Sufi. So the word Sufi early on didn't have a negative connotation necessarily. Nowadays, it's used as a pejorative sometimes, but certain groups have, number one, hijacked it, monopolized it. And other groups have used it to attack people. You know, oh, don't follow that scholar, he's a Sufi, you know. And so I want to kind of do away with those terms. We don't need to entertain that debate because it's kind of pigeonholes people. I want to look at spirituality as a whole. Do we accept the underlying principles of spirituality? And I believe that all Muslims accept the kind of principles of spirituality, and where it's gone wrong are in other places, which I'll explain. Now, I want to look at eras, and that's what I want to begin with. What spirituality means early on and how it kind of changes. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's no need really for there's no need to refer to anybody but the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ is the masdar of all good and beauty. He's the kind of essence, he's a root and source of everything you need to know. You need to know halal and haram, messenger of God. You need to know how to have more sabr, you go to the Prophet ﷺ. You want to know how to change your life, reform your life, you go to the Prophet ﷺ. You want to know how to run your business in terms of if it's halal or haram, you go to the Prophet ﷺ. You want barakah in your life, you may go to the Prophet ﷺ and ask for dua, and he'll pray for your barakah. And unfortunately, of course, we people in this era are at loss now because we don't have the Prophet ﷺ anymore, and we were not one of those. I wouldn't call them lucky ones because we're probably not there for a reason, but definitely we don't have the fortune of having been in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. So, and we struggle with that. Every Muslim and believer struggles with that. The fact that we don't have this direct guidance, Baytul Nubuwah, where we can just go to the Messenger of God and just, you know, get these answers and this spiritual training and improve our lives and build that connection physically with Him. So we're at a loss in that, from that perspective. But we can reflect over the lives of those early people. So in the time of the Prophet, how is spirituality seen? Meaning, how do we see things pertaining to the soul? How is it done in that period? Imam al-Ghazali mentions something very interesting here. He talks about tahara, and he says that, look, tahara, I'm talking about wudu. If you're confused about the term, making wudu, for instance, just one element of tahara means purity, one element of that is making wudu. And he says, look, the Madinah al-Munawwara was a place where there were animals, a lot of animals, domestic animals, and animals that were used for other things as well, and a lot of wild animals as well. But anyway, people would have camels and sheep and goats, and they still had to make wudu. And he talks about the fact that many people prayed in their shoes, by the way, just as a side note. It's sunnah to pray in your shoes as well, sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. There are some caveats with that. But he did, alayhi salatu wasalam, pray in his blessed sandals many times. And Imam Mullah al-Qari has a whole text on this, discussing it. Now, considering that, they would make wudu and pray in the sandals as well. They make wudu, but the point he's trying to make is wudu was pretty easy to make for people. You made it, but that wasn't their central consideration. He believed that their central consideration of the Sahaba was the internal of these acts of wudu, of salah, of all of these things was an internal element, that they were worried about how their heart is connected to those actions. The physical actions were easy to do in salah as well, ruku, sajda, qu'ud, all of these things. And in his time, Ghazali believed that the fuqaha, I don't know if he blames the fuqaha necessarily, but he kind of has a dig at the ulama that there's so much obsession now about the furu', meaning about the legal elements of all of Islam, the salah, the legal elements. I'm talking about the nitty-gritty, the nuances, the minutiae, that people have forgotten about the spiritual elements. And I'll give an example of that. You can study in a madrasa, or you can study in a good institute or whatever, study Sharia. And the first year you study a book of law, fiqh. Let's take Hanafi fiqh. In the second year you probably study another book of law. Third year, fourth year, you probably finish 3 to 5 books, solid study of Islamic law. At the end of that, does that better your prayer in any way? People assume that because your relationship with God better, it may do to a certain degree, but it's not necessary. So the more fiqh you study, the more Islamic law you study, it doesn't make you better at performing your prayers necessarily. In fact, often it doesn't at all. It makes you perform the prayer correctly, but doesn't make the prayer better for you. This is something very important, and what he was trying to stress was that the spiritual dimensions, and this is why in the Ihya he has all of these books like Kitab al-Tahara, the book of purity, because he's talking about the spiritual elements. And that's something very important. The companions in the early period, the law was a means for them. They used the law as a means. But what they were really concerned about was kind of the spiritual connection that they took from that. And that's why the Aisha said, the first thing to leave the Muslims after the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ was al-khudu' al-khushu' fi salah, was the tranquility or the ease, the tranquility or the statelessness of oneself in prayer. That the khushu', the tranquility, was lost immediately almost after the Prophet ﷺ left this world. And that was a huge concern, of course, for her, seeing that the true kind of nature of Islam is the spiritual elements. Now, if we move on a little bit, and this is what I'll comment on towards the end, when we talk about al-muhasabi, spirituality still continues, and there's a stress. There is a kind of great importance given to spirituality. So we have early Muslims like Hassan al-Basri, and I picked today to talk a little bit about Hassan al-Basri, and I want to demystify him today. There's a huge problem that we have currently in our narrative of spirituality, and that is that I don't know if exaggerate is the right word, or misrepresent is probably the right word. Early spirituality, we do misrepresent it. So what we do is we take people like Hassan al-Basri, or somebody much later than him, Junaid, or al-Muhasabi even, and we make them out like they were people of, they were kind of these, I don't know what people make them into, but my feeling is that people make them into these unreachable, ununderstandable spiritualists, or people of God, that somehow were not involved in the world at all in any way or form. When in fact the opposite is true. Well, not the opposite is true, but there's a balance to it. Hassan al-Basri, for instance, had a position with the government under Abdul Malik bin Marwan. He actually had a job and this is mentioned by Joseph Van Ness and other people as well, about his early occupation, where he actually worked for the government. He had a particular job, and then they changed his job, and he also taught in the masjid, and that was the main kind of means of people teaching in the masjid. And he had famous students, and his main kind of field, it seems, area was tafsir of Quran, definitely. Spirituality for him was not like a taught science. It was not like you turn up with a book and you say, oh, this is a particular book, and Sheikh, I want to study it with you. It wasn't like that. Spirituality for Hassan al-Basri was something very real and something very proper. One of his students, for instance, states that I spent 20 years with him, and there was not a day except he would talk about the akhirah. So it was something very practical and something very real for him, for Hassan al-Basri. And similar imams, imam that were at the beginning of the Islamic era, especially in the first generation, Abu Hanifa, their spirituality was incredibly practical. And the reason I said there was I want to kind of debunk this idea that we have now is people have kind of assumed spirituality to be something that's not real anymore, something that's not, where you can't have a job and be a spiritual person, or be a school teacher and be a spiritual person, or as if these people, all they did was they just sat in a masjid and they just taught tasawwuf. It wasn't like that at all. They had a normal life, and their spirituality was shown in how they applied the laws that God had sent down and the sunnah of the Prophet in their real life. They showed it in that way. And now it's not that at all, of course. Now it's just praising people and talking about awliya and talking about miracles, and you're talking about this particular sheikh's hal and this particular sheikh's hal and this particular sheikh performed this miracle. None of this was done in the early generation. You won't find it in any of the kutub in that way. It was real spirituality, what kind of raw spirituality. Now this continued, and you can see this in the kind of in the behavior of the fuqaha, the early scholars, Imam Malik radiallahu ta'ala, Abu Hanifa, Al-Awza'i, Sa'id ibn Jubair. You see this kind of in the early Muslims and the way they were, and you'll find really odd things and odd stories about them as well, which I can't really share today because it's a different topic. But that you think, did that Imam really say that or do that? And that your expectation of the Imam is completely different to what he probably was and the way he kind of manifested his spirituality. But anyway, we get to a point where I want to get to Imam Muhasabi now. Imam Muhasabi is very interesting. Abu Abdullah al-Harith ibn Asad al-Muhasabi, who dies in, nobody really knows when he's born, but he dies in 243. Now, he's an incredibly interesting person for me because he's one of the earliest people to have written a text book, call it a textbook or a book, a short book on spirituality. It's called Risalat al-Mustarshidin. I think it's translated in English, not sure. And it's an incredible work. I mean, it's unbelievable work. But the fact that it's so early gives us a kind of window into what spirituality was at that time. That's our kind of window in. Now, his name, interestingly, he was known as Al-Muhasabi. Now, Muhasabi means, that wasn't his name, of course. It means the one who constantly is introspective, and it became his name or title for him, that the one who was constantly kind of looking at his internal. Al-Muhasabi. Muhasaba in Arabic means to kind of al-muhasaba is like to take account of something, but in this particular case in spirituality is to take account of oneself. Al-muhasaba, to count like your deeds and your behavior, etc. So he's a window in, and here I want to kind of explain why this topic is so important and why we have so many kind of problems with spirituality right now. And I want to talk about some of those problems before I go into Al-Muhasabi himself, and I want to actually discuss at the beginning of his book. Currently, spirituality for people is different things for different people, like I said. But I want to kind of remove a few things that spirituality is certainly not. Number one, spirituality cannot be monopolized by people of turuq, for instance. This is really unfortunate, by the way. And I want to briefly mention the idea of this idea of turuq and tariqah and how it was and how it's become. At some period, in a late period, not an early period, we have a formulation of this idea of pathways, spiritual paths. And they normally occur when a particular man of spirituality, a man of God maybe, a true man of God. He reached God in a particular way. He had a particular practice about him, i.e., that he was a man maybe of shukr, let's say. So his path was a path of shukr, of gratitude. So he taught his students that gratitude is the way to God, and my way is the way of gratitude. And it appealed to them. He understood their cultural kind of norms. He grew up with them, probably was from their local village or town. And he took all of these students on and began to purify their hearts, or they began to kind of work with him, this sheikh, and he would correct their faults, pick things out. But there's something very important in that narrative, and that is that most of these shuyukh, most of these people that were heads of these spiritual orders at that time, lived in a place with their disciples. It wasn't an international thing. And their customs were the same, the culture was the same. So it was easy to accept and easy to take advice from that person because he understood your cultural paradigm. And they grew up with that person. You could have been a disciple of a certain sheikh, and you were, because you lived, a few houses away from him, and you'd go to the masjid with him, etc. So when so-and-so says, a particular person says, I spent 20 years with this sheikh, meaning maybe 700-800 years ago, it's probably by virtue of the fact that they lived on the same street. It's by virtue of the fact that they were very in close proximity, and you would end up spending 20 years with that particular sheikh. He was the imam of the masjid, or he was a teacher in the madrasa, or something of that nature. Now, a lot of pathways began, you kind of see a lot of turuq in particular periods, especially post 5th century. You see loads of hijri, you see loads of these turuq kind of popping up. The main objective wasn't the path. That was not the objective. The tariqah, what they called, is a tu'raf al-ma'ani la mushahata bil asami. If the meaning is known, there's no need for names. The names were superfluous. They don't add any value, of course. So people now saying I'm from this path, that adds no value to spirituality. What added value was their sohbah with that particular man. Okay. Now we know now from modern studies on spirituality and healing and these things that is a very important relationship that we need. We need to be taught almost about spirituality to a degree, i.e., that we need somebody there that has mastered the art, the path, his own soul, to then give us those tips, those guidelines, that knowledge, passes it on to us, of how then we take that knowledge and apply it to our lives. That's a must. That I don't have any disagreement about that people are required on that path, and they were there before. But it was the people that were required, not this kind of systemization. When we compartmentalized, systematized it, it became incredibly problematic. It may have been okay for a while, but I'll give you an example. Sheikh Ahmed Alawi, who was a man of path as well, he died in 1934 in Mustaghanam, in Sheikh Aliwa in Algeria, of path. But if you read that period in Algeria in early 1900s, there's so many zawiyas and paths, and many of them are just fighting each other. And this is not new to kind of our tradition. We hear about spiritual orders fighting one another. This has been happening for hundreds of years. This is unfortunately a problem that occurs from this. When you begin to systematize things so precisely, it creates groups, and those groups often fight each other. The irony is, of course, they're supposed to be groups of spirituality, but clearly they missed the point. So, and there's stories that are mentioned in Ashwaib al-Fatawa about Sheikh Alawi, about other zawiyas, saying bad things about him and cursing him and saying that who does he think he is, and you find all of these types of things. So that was a huge problem, and it's antithetical to the idea of spirituality in the first place. So the original understanding of order was really the person, i.e., the only thing that's important is the master and the disciple relationship. Nothing else is important. Everything else is superfluous. What's important there is the master's instructing, and the disciple takes. This is from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the master, the messenger of God, our master. Rasulullah ﷺ is spiritually ordering, and they're obeying, and all the disciples are there, and they're benefiting, or whatever prophet it may be. Previously, Sayyidina Isa and the Hawariyin, same thing. That's what's important, and that's what's been lost, unfortunately. Now it's all about people talking about path there or this, and often, to be honest with you, like Sheikh Bhuti said, Muhammad bin Sa'id, Muhammad Saeed Ramadan Bhoti, he talked about that. He said, you know, and he was moaning about where are these men and where are these orders anymore? Meaning the real people of God have passed away. They are very rare. That's his point there. Nadir. Ghazali complained about this 900 years, 800 years ago, that it's nadir now. You know, in his statement about find a man of spirituality, a sheikh, he said it's nadir, it's rare. You're not gonna, if you can't, then he said find a good friend, you know, that will tell you your faults. And he said if you can't, then he said listen carefully to your enemies, because often what your enemies say about you is true. And Sheikh Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani complained about the same thing in his period. It's nadir. How is it now that they're everywhere? We've gone from periods where real spiritual masters are dying and they're very rare, to now having them, they've got their own Facebook pages and they're just out there. There's so many of them now. And what happens? We have this big fallout now. And that's not to say they're not real spiritual people out there. I definitely believe they are. They are definitely, because God preserves, God always, this is how the religion of God is preserved through people. And they are out there, don't get me wrong. And I believe I've come across a few, definitely. But they're very rare. They're very rare. And what you have now is just chanting disciples of the name of their spiritual kind of head, just to, and there's no substance to it. There's no real substance. These people's lives are not changing. People fall out of love very quickly, and people are abused. And this is the point, that one point that I wanted to make, that be very careful of what our framework is for spirituality. The central framework for all spirituality is Sharia. It's a law that God revealed, and Muhasabi is going to talk about that when I mention it, inshallah. If anybody contradicts the law of God, then you've got to leave them, push them away. They're not from the people of God. It's impossible that a man of God, a person of God, is at the same time one who guides and breaks the laws or the boundaries or the limits that God has set him. It's just not going to happen. And don't be easily duped into spirituality as well, i.e., just because you hear somebody give a fantastic speech and it hits you right here, that doesn't mean they're spiritual guides, even if they claim it. For instance, somebody said to me that, oh, there's this particular man and he must be spiritually of a high status, and I want to follow him because he comes in people's dreams. That means nothing. That means nothing. The Prophet ﷺ said, he said, "Man yarani faqad yara al-haq, faqad ra'a al-haq." Anybody who sees me has surely seen the truth. The truth, meaning me, he has surely seen me. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَتَخَيَّلُ بِي. For indeed the devil cannot take my form. That's the messenger of God. Everybody else, I'm not saying if you see a sheikh that it's a shaitan. Only the messenger of God has been given that elect status where if you see him, you see him. Just because you have a dream about somebody doesn't mean anything. When did we become people who just follow dreams loosely? That I'm going to follow this person because I'm having dreams about him. Or I had a wonderful speech and it hit me right here. That doesn't mean anything. I'm sure you've heard speeches by non-Muslims that hit you there in the heart as well, particular topics that don't make them your spiritual masters. So be very careful about that. So the Sharia is a central kind of anchor that we employ to judge the spirituality of anybody. And that's very important. And unfortunately, we have to be very careful about that. We also have to be very careful about people promoting themselves, very importantly. If you find people promoting themselves then, and you can see that all they do is promote themselves and call you to them, then there's a big problem. If they call you to God and God's messenger, then it's okay. You're on the right road. But this is another problem that we find in some of the pitfalls now, and how spirituality has been really lost. Now I want to talk about, inshallah ta'ala, get to muhasabi, and I want to get into what early spirituality, the window that we wanted to look at, what early spirituality was, and what he wrote about it. And I want to begin by I want to comment on a little bit about his book, or on his book. He begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, he begins his book, and I'm just going to leave out the introduction. And he begins with a particular verse from Quran. And that verse is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأن هذا الصراط مستقيما فاتبعوه. ولا تتبعوا السبل فتفرق بكم عن سبيله ذلكم وصاكم به لعلكم تتقون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that that is my path, the straight one. God is talking about his straight path. So follow it. And do not follow other paths, for they will lead you away from the path that I have set for you. This is what I have obligated you with, so that you may come to be aware of God. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. He begins with that verse, and the verse is really striking because there's two central elements there. That God's path is very clear for everybody. That's number one. And number two, that there are a lot of conflicting paths with the path of God, and we have to avoid those paths and stay on the path of God. Now, what he then does is he brings immediately after that a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Alaykum bis-sunnati wa sunnati al-khulafa'i ar-rashidin min ba'di, addu 'alayha bin-nawajid." That the Prophet ﷺ said that you must follow my way and the way of my companions, and specifically the early leaders, al-khulafa ar-rashidin, those rightly guided after me. Hold on to it with your teeth, essentially. So there's two elements here. The one is the path of God, and then the path of God being explained through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And here I made a little list of the things that he mentions right from the beginning of what true spirituality is. This window that we have when we look into Muhasibi's life and his text, of what he's writing only 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ, of what he considers to be, inshallah I'll answer those questions, what he considers to be true spirituality, and something really, some wonderful things he mentions. The first thing he mentions, which he said is the first thing, is what God's book obligates upon you. Something interesting I want to tell you. I remember once somebody came to me, they asked me a question. I can't remember what it was, and I said to them, look, read a certain surah in the Quran. I can't remember, Surah Yasin or so Mulk, I really can't remember. He said, do I need an ijazah for that? And I was like, I don't know whether to, because I get why he's asking that question, but I was so kind of perturbed by what's led human beings to that they need now ijazah, to permission, by the way, that is, to read a particular surah of Quran. From who? Who's going to give you permission above God? God said, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." Does anybody need permission to read God's book? But unfortunately, that's what's become of it. What's become of it is these ignorant people out there who call themselves spiritual leaders have restricted the religion to such a degree that their followers are only allowed to take it from them. They can't take anything except unless it's from them. This is complete, absolute jahl, ignorance. My teacher, Mufti Subak Sa'idi, Allah yahfadhu, he was so anti this idea that the Quran was revealed to me and you. It was revealed to all of us. And we're obligated to read it. Allah says in the Quran that the Quran on the Day of Judgment says, "Oh Allah, they have left me mahjura. They abandoned me," meaning people abandoned me. I mean, that's your central thing to go to test if this man's a man of God to begin with. But that's how they manipulated often the minds of their followers, you see, where their followers even think, oh, should I even read the Quran? Like, maybe I should ask the Shaykh, maybe if I should open it and read it. And unfortunately, maybe he can't read the Quran, that's why he's telling them not to read it. You have a lot of that in the subcontinent, unfortunately. Almost all of these so-called spiritual leaders and masters, they are all jahala. They're all ignorant people. One simple example is, and you should out him because, just to save our subcontinent people here, is this this guy who's you sometimes think what people are thinking, like what drives people to such ignorance. This guy's on a microphone and they've made so many brilliant memes out of it, and he's got this tasbih and he's just pulling on it and chuffing into a microphone. And there's brilliant memes, if you check him out, he deserves the memes, where he goes chuff, and then like there's a tornado and somebody's house is blown. That's sad, of course, that's not good. Or chuff, and somebody's wig falls off. But he should be, the people should talk about that. and there are hundreds of people there holding their heads, you know. And it's like that phone-in guy, you know, you phone him, one of these AOY or something like that. You phone in and he says, hold your head. Where does it hurt? He said, just right here. He said, hold it. And he's like, blah, 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 blah. I don't know what he's reading. And he said, does it feel better? And you're thinking, yeah, you know what? It's gone away. Complete rubbish. Stop giving your money or your iman to these people. They're frauds. All of them are charlatans. Go to the doctor. SubhanAllah. I mean, I wonder what they're going to chuff away at death. You know, do you know that there's a wonderful story of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud? You know, people being obsessed with ta'wizat and these things. Oh, I'm ill, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is passing away. He's on his deathbed. Sayyidina Uthman comes to him. He says, should I get you somebody who can treat you like a doctor? He said, Amradani tabib. The doctor, the one who treats, the one who cures, has given me the illness, meaning God. He said, should I leave something for your daughters, money or wealth for them, something for them? And he said, Taraktu lahunna surat al-waqi'ah. I've left surat al-waqi'ah for them. I'm not saying people shouldn't do medicine. I'm not saying that in any way or form. But the fact that he was passing away, was unwell. Do you think that if we could just blow away every illness, and we're going to get to bala today, inshallah, we're going to look at bala, difficulties, that it's that easy, that I can write something on a piece of paper and you can just take it and your problem is going to go away. What about all the problems that the companions went through? What about all the difficulties that prophets go through? You think it was easy enough just to write something down? Do you think life is supposed to be easy? I mean, we really need to think about these things. Now, he talks about the book of Allah, al-amalu bi hukmihi min al-amri wa nahi, to follow God's commands and to also stay away from his prohibitions. And he says, al-khawf wa raja li wa'di wa wa'idihi, to have hope in his promise and fear of his threat. Wal-imanu bi mushabihi wal-i'tibaru bi qasasi wa amthalihi, and to have belief in those things that are obscure and to rely upon the stories and the examples that God gives in the Quran. And he writes something, this line really struck me for that. فَإِذَا أَتَيْتَ بِذَلِكَ فَقَدْ خَرَجْتَ مِنْ ظُلُمَاتِ الْجَهْلِ إِلَى النُّورِ الْعِلْمِ. If you reach that, if you understand these things that he says, he's mentioned, he said, most certainly you have left darkness and you've entered the single light. Because when God talks about مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ, he talks about leaving many, dhulumat is plural here, it's not singular, that you leave many ways of darkness or paths of darkness into a single light. And that's the path that we talked about earlier. Now, he mentions a few other things, that, and one statement of Sayyidina Ali that really struck me. And he says, therefore, that God's given you aql. And I'm not going to really deeply discuss this book, but and to stay away from halal and haram. So I want to get to this statement, these 2 points now. He says, after this idea that one is acquainted themselves with the rules that God has set us, he talks about the idea of niyyah and awareness, and then sabr, and these three things he makes gives a lot of stresses quite a bit. And I want to talk about them, and then I want to comment about one of them specifically. He says, number one, everything is anchored in niyyah, in intention. That the first lesson of spirituality is having the right intention about you, that everything is dependent on that. Your good deeds, your even your bad intentions are important. And what do I mean by that? Because if one has an intention that's bad but doesn't carry through the action, he's rewarded for that. Even that we have to be cognizant of. And then he talks about the main thing, what makes muhasibi is self-reflection. He says about self-reflection that وَحَاسِبْ نَفْسَكَ فِي كُلِّ خَطْرَ, that with every thought, be reflective about yourself, with every single thought. And then he said, وَرَاقِبِ اللَّهِ فِي كُلِّ نَفْسٍ, that in every breath, really deeply think about what you're like. He says, think of وَرَاقِبِ اللَّهِ, be observant of God, but he's really talking about more so about be aware of kind of your final goal. And he said about Sayyidina Umar, hasibu anfusakum qabla an tuhasabu. Sayyidina Umar said, take yourself to account before you are taken to account by God. This is a window into what early spirituality was. Completely self-reflection, muraqabah. that the main work is from you. The main work is from you. And then he quotes Sayyidina Ali, and this statement of Sayyidina Ali really, really touched me and blew me away, actually. Sayyidina Ali says the following, and I'm going to comment on each part of his statement. He said that he said قال علي رضي الله تعالى عنه لا تخف إلا ذنبك ولا ترجو إلا ربك ولا يستحي الذي لا يعلم أن يسأل حتى يعلم ولا يستحي من يسأل أما لا يعلم أن يقول لا أعلم. Now, there's some important things in that he says, that things like don't have raja, don't have hope in anything except God, that put all your hopes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the next point is what I actually wanted to comment on. He says وَعَلَمْ أَنَّ الصَّبْرَ, that patience is from iman, having patience. بِمَنْزِلَةِ الرَّأْسِ مِنَ الْجَسَدِ, is like the head on the body. That's what status it takes. فَإِذَا قُطِعَ رَأْسُ ذَهَبَ الْجَسَدِ, if you take the head off, you'll die. And that's what sabr does to the body, that if you lose sabr, you lose your iman. Just bear with me, sorry. You lose your iman. Then he says, فَإِذَا سَمِعْتَ كَلِمَةً تُغْضِبُكَ فِي أَرْضِكَ فَأْفُ وَاصْفَحْ. If you hear something that angers you, that's about your honor, he said, forgive it, overlook it. It doesn't benefit you by getting angry about it. Try to overlook it. Then he mentions a statement from then he says the following, sorry. وَاشْتَغِلْ بِإِصْلَاحِ نَفْسِكَ, that always busy yourself in correcting yourself, عن عيب غيرك. فإنه كان يقال كفى بالمرء عيبا أن يستبين له من الناس ما يخفى عليه من نفسه. He talks about this idea, and this is quite important, about when other people do wrong things, when other people do bad things. What should we take from it? Many of the ulama have talked about this. That other people's wrongdoings are not our concern, of course, but we should thank Allah, the fact that He clarified or made open for us maybe other people's wrongdoing, so we don't do the same thing. That we don't do the same thing. There is a weak hadith in Tirmidhi that a person who hears about a sin of another person and exposes it will not die except that they will commit that sin. Now, the hadith is weak, don't get me wrong. What a powerful statement, I mean, if that were true. Because the hadith is weak, we're uncertain about it, but it's, I mean, you know, take what you wish from it. He says, وَاسْتَعْمِلْ لِلَّهِ عَقْلَكَ بِتَرْكِ التَّدْبِيرِ وَاسْتَعِنْ بِاللَّهِ عَلَى صَرْفِ الْمَقَادِيرِ قال علي. Then he says, يَا ابْنَ آدَمَ, this is the main part. لَا تَفْرَحْ بِالْغِنَى, O son of Adam, don't rejoice with wealth. When if you're rich, you have wealth, you're poor. وَلَا تَحْزَنْ بِالْبَلَى, and don't feel sad when you have difficulties in your life. وَتَحْزَنْ بِالْبَلَى, don't see that as, don't cry yourself into a state of no return almost. Bilbala. Bala, like any difficulty or tribulation we have. وَلَا تَفْرَحْ بِالرَّخَاءِ, and don't be happy that you're comfortable currently. Don't rejoice in your comfort that you have, because it can be taken away from you. فَإِنَّ الذَّهَبَ يُجَرَّبُ بِالنَّارِ, that gold is tested, if it's fake or if it's actually gold, is tested with fire. يُجَرَّب بِالنَّارِ, we burn it to find out how, if it's real gold. وَإِنَّ الْعَبْدَ الصَّالِحِ يُجَرَّب بِالْبَلَى, and a true servant of God is tested with difficulty in the same way. This is a statement of Sayyidina Ali. وَإِنَّكَ لَا تَنَالُ مَا تُرِيدُ إِلَّا بِتَرْكِ مَا تَشْتَهِي, you will never gain, you will never acquire, you will never gain what you want. So this is really profound, because it needs quite a bit of unpacking. That with true kind of belief, it only comes through leaving things often. things that are destroying us, things that spiritually destroy us, that we have to make tark of them. We can't just keep them there and expect results. Then he says, وَلَن تَبْلُغَ مَا تُؤَمِّلُ إِلَّا بِالصَّبْرِ عَلَى مَا تَكْرَهُ. You will never reach that which you hope for except with patience of that which you dislike. Meaning you will never reach a maqam, a status, except if you can put up with that which you dislike. Have sabr with it. Then he talks about, he says, become firm in the struggle, I would say, of your own nafs. How do you do that? By observing that which God has obligated upon you. Yeah, that which God has obligated upon you. And then he has loads of other things, and I would love maybe to do a full kind of teaching of the entire book from beginning to end. It's only a short book. Maybe Allah will give barakah and time, and we can do that some other time, and that'll be important. What I want to take away, and I only wanted to read a bit of the muqaddimah and little snippets of it on purpose, because I wanted to highlight, for me early spirituality is very important. As just a general person, I really like to the front of the book, you can see it's backwards. Then you can get it from Amazon, actually. So what I really like to tap into is early Islam, especially spirituality, because we're the same people in the sense that we're flesh and bone, and we have different circumstances, but they live through a lot of difficulty as well. How did they view the way of the Prophet ﷺ? How did they view it? How did they view spirituality? How did they view the nafs, the soul, the ruh? How did they review struggles? How did they review what's spiritually obligatory on people? The early Muslim, because their window is much bigger than our window. Our window is like this big, and we have a window to them, and often we don't see the real window, the greater window to the Prophet ﷺ and his life and his period. So they understood Islam much better than us. What really struck me when I first read this book was how pure his kind of teachings were. He was straight to muhasabah. He said it's all about muhasabah. He told you that from the beginning, and he said it's not going to be easy. Spirituality is very difficult, and muhasabah is very difficult, but there's no easy ride, and you're inevitably responsible for your own spirituality. Yes, we take it from spiritual masters if we can find them and we can get that from them, but inevitably you're still responsible for it. And that's what Abdullah Sha'rani said. In the absence of these spiritual masters, he talked about kathrat salawat ala Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, that one should be constantly making salawat upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's something that the end of times will help people. Now, I want to finish up here before I take questions, because we're closing in. Is the takeaway today behind the whole demystify? I know it's not, I could have expanded more on different things, but that my purpose today was to attempt anyway to kind of provide that window for you, what early spirituality was, and that to declutter your understanding of what spirituality actually is. Spirituality is something very simple. It's basit. It's not complicated. It's not academic. It's not how much somebody knows or how nicely they can put it to you. It's pure practice. Pure, and it's very difficult in the sense of doing it is difficult, knowing it is easy. And that difficulty is something that we signed up to when we said Amantu Billahi. We signed up to that difficulty. And like he said about sabr and bala and these types of things, these are the kind of lessons we need to take. This is our window into early spirituality and how the early masters understood it. Inshallah, I'm going to take questions. I have quite a few. Hamza, fire them onto my WhatsApp as well. I'll take them from there. What do you think of the sons of a spiritual taking over once the father passed away? I'll tell you a story about that, actually. I have a story for that. Imam Kharputi, the great Imam who wrote to come to in the Burda, Al-Asida, he actually says, I heard that, he talks about this. He says, there's this story, he said, this practice that I'm hearing about, where a man of God dies and he puts his son in his place, and he just slams it, to be honest with you. He says, what on earth is this? This is simple. Islam is not a monarchy, by the way. why would a son take over his father? In fact, I think it was one of the early ulama, Abdullah bin Mubarak, maybe it was later scholar, I don't remember, said very rarely are the sons of scholars, which shows you that even for people of ilm, very rarely are their children ulama, because the relationship between a son and a father is not the same as a father, if he was a sheikh, a scholar, and a student. They're different. The dynamics are different. But this idea that the son takes over is nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with our religion. That and proof of that is look at the relationship between, say, the Amir Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala an. Amir Muawiyah is a Sahabi. Is one of those people who saw the Messenger of God and is considered a companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, look at his son, Yazid. Nobody has anything good to say about him. So the point here is that rank is not transferable by lineage. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said in a famous hadith, Imam Nawawi includes it in his 40, one who is slow in his actions, one who does not kind of fulfill one who does not perform good deeds, his lineage will not speed his lineage will not speed anything up for him. His lineage will not save him, essentially. So no, we don't have this idea in our religion at all. So this is something that happens in the subcontinent. In fact, it happens in other countries as well. I can't just say subcontinent. It happens there a lot, though, and it's ridiculous. That's and the thing is, people say, but what if the son's spiritual? But have you realized the subcontinent? That's all that happens. The sheikh dies and his son takes over. So yeah, I don't buy into that. So agreeing with your views on spiritual leaders currently, some share a reluctance to join a specific one. Would you say there's a necessity to follow one, or will a teacher suffice? There's no necessity to follow a spiritual path. No, people argue it. Often the people who argue it are the people who are the heads of a spiritual path. That's ironic. Of course it is. Irony in that. Do you see the point? That, you have to follow a spiritual path. Are you a sheikh? Yeah, I'm a sheikh as well, a spiritual path. Go figure. I mean, no, there's no obligation. In this day and age, definitely not an obligation. Who are you going to follow? I mean, I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm sure there are people out there that are spiritual people that have a path and you can follow and it's valid. I'm not saying that at all. But it's nadir. It's very rare. The people who say that it's wajib, tell me who to follow. Sheikh Bhuti said the same. Sheikh Jamum Said said the same thing. Is not only him, my own teacher. Whoever may have an issue with Sheikh Muhammad Saeed Ramadan Bhuti, whoever has an issue with him, fine. But many of my teachers, my kind of main teacher was of the exact position from when I started, right at the beginning when I started studying with him. Who are you going to accept, you see? And by the way, when you're giving yourself to somebody for spiritual training, most of these sheikhs are not even anywhere near you. You're lucky if you get them on YouTube. But what exactly are you giving handing over, you see? It's a big responsibility. My beloved friend of mine and a teacher, I consider a guide himself, to me anyway. I haven't had to give air to him or anything like that. Sheikh Muhammad Adwan, in my house, we were talking about this, and I asked him about just the idea, and he said it's a huge responsibility to take the responsibility of somebody else's nafs. You have to be really sure that you've got the tools for that. You're taking somebody else's nafs, and you're going to fix them. You're going to train them. It's a big responsibility. Very few are deserving of that. I will tell you that. Now, I remember meeting a great man, Sheikh Tanbir Ashrafi Rahimullah, passed away now. And somebody asked him a question. We were there in the hotel room in Makkah. He was quite elderly there. This is a man, they say, that he spent 25 years in seclusion. And somebody asked him about Khadr being alive. And they said to him that, if I remember the story correctly, that we hear that Khadr is alive and that he's on Hajj and Day of Arafah, so we're making Hajj that year. And he just smiled. And he said, why are you asking me that question? He said, do you know? He said, how do I know? He said, go and find a man of God. maybe he'll know. And when you find him, he said, call me and I'll come as well. I mean, look at the humility of the man. I mean, he never married as well. He was, so kind of distant in that sense. And he was, when I met him, he was in his 70s, I think. So look at the humility of a man like that. So my point is that, I agree with the sentiments there. Teachers, of course, they suffice. Many people never take a spiritual shake, but their teachers were incredible people of God, and they took all the spirituality they needed from their teachers. What they call mujalasat salihin. They sat with the people of godly people, good people, were around good people. Have you not met people that that are people who that die and they're unbelievable people of God? My grandmother, she's still alive. I consider her to be. I've met many people who claim to be people of God. I've met many people who I believe are people of God. My own grandmother, I believe, and I've said this publicly, I believe to be a woman of God, a great woman of God, far surpasses many of the people of these people that I've met, and even people of God that I've met. We have them in our family sometimes, you see. Which tariqah did she submit to? Which word did she read? No, a simple woman. That doesn't make her a great person that you can't gain from, that you can take from, that you can see and watch and observe. By the way, just many ulama, they've just spent many years with their teachers, and the teachers happened to be. I remember reading a biography about a great man of God, a faqih, a Maliki faqih from Morocco, and they said that he was hidden behind, his spirituality was hidden behind his books, meaning he never showed it to people, but his students took it from him, but it was hidden behind his teaching. He just would teach all the time. So this is something kind of very, very important, I believe. What would you say to those who defend chuf? Nothing. You know what? I read something important today, that Malcolm X statement, that don't mock people that haven't reached the understanding that you have today or something. A lot of these people are innocent, to be honest with you. They don't have much knowledge and things like that. So just pray that they come to knowledge and they understand these things and they leave a person like that. Often what Ghazali says, if you criticize him to them, they're just going to run away further from you. It's not a wise way. If somebody loves him, do it in a nice way to get him away. Don't say, oh, he's a deviant, he's a fraud, he's a charlatan. Look at this video, showing one of the meme videos. Don't do that, of course. Just get him away in a different way. They say he is Sayyid and he's reciting Quran. So, what does that? Does that protect him from not following? Does that protect him from Sharia? Well, reciting Quran. Wallah, I've been listening to Quran for a large part of my life. I've never heard the Quran sound like this. Have you heard the Quran sound like that? وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, Allah says in the Quran. I don't want to waste my time with that. I really struggle to get a hold of my teacher, and I find sometimes my contact doesn't even go to him. How would I be navigating something like this? Look, I can't answer that question necessarily. I don't know who he is. If you can contact with him, email or whatever, I'm not sure. But I mean, try to. My advice always is try to have local teachers. Try to have teachers that are accessible, locally, especially in terms of lessons, or they're going to be at the gathering, or they're going to be at the lesson. They'll be there, and that helps a lot. Local things, local teachers are very, very important. If you had to give 5 points of focus to us to go away and practice, what would they be? I don't tell anybody to practice anything. That's your business at the end of the day. I'm here just to impart some knowledge that maybe I've gained over the years. Hopefully you can. So I won't really share that. Did you not give yourself to a sheikh? I mean, I'm not important here, so please don't make this about me as well. And we do learn as we go along, as we get older as well. I think 5 points of focus, 5 takeaways maybe. I think 5's too many. I'm going to let you decide. I think there was quite a few takeaways. Maybe, Hamza, that maybe be focus of another discourse on 5 points of focus, and then we can just discuss those. That would be better. Shall I take the last couple of few questions? What's the difference between a teacher and a mentor? I don't know. There's just words. I mean, it depends how you take that, what you take that to mean, a teacher and a mentor. I would say that sometimes a teacher of knowledge is not necessarily a mentor always. They teach you ilm, but they don't really want to give you anything more. You study fiqh with them and you just leave. One of my teachers studied hadith with, he just wanted you to read the text and then go home. It was like kind of yuqadr al-waqt, yani he was quite about your time was important to him. He wasn't like, he didn't care about what you're doing, or that wasn't his business. I mean, other teachers were different. My own teacher, my main teacher, he taught me a lot about life and life skills. He gave me, I used to do a lot for him personally, so I learned a lot from that. So I consider him a mentor. Then I have other people that are not teachers but that I look up to, that fulfill that mentor role, that I would seek advice from them and things of that nature. And but remember that doesn't have to be a a'la process. It doesn't have to be higher than you. Like, I'll seek advice from my wife. You have to be a sheikh, so it's not like that. So probably a mentor can be anybody really, but a teacher, if you get a teacher that's a mentor as well, that's unbelievable. That really helps. Yeah, so any other questions before we? Okay, I'll be the same question. So how do we suggest people work on practicing more rather than learning more, especially when it comes to contemplation of accountability? Very good. I do believe we need workshops. I do believe that we need now it's changed, because old books of spirituality, they even like this to a degree, need to be unpacked and need to be put into modern language, and we need focus points. Of course, this discourse is the job of this discourse is opening the discussion up. But we will need workshops, inshallah. When I'm back in Solihull on the ground, we will be doing many more workshops like this. Workshops are very important, because workshops to kind of give the basic steps. Everybody needs basic steps. And the question was, how do we kind of gauge that? How do we put out there that we need to practice more and learn less? I don't believe necessarily there's a contradiction there. We can continue learning, but our practice needs to be it needs to be balanced with learning. I.e., sometimes we're learning loads, but we're practicing very little. There's an imbalance there. And I think that needs to really be looked at. And I'll give you a simple example. Take not a really early book. It's quite recent in those terms, a few hundred years. In that book, the Sheikh's talking about Ramadan and Quran in Ramadan. And he said that the haqq of the Quran is that, one Quran is read. And he talks about early Muslims reading 2 or 3. But we have to remember now, we can't teach that in that way. Because there are people, especially look in the UK, in England, people barely pray. People barely have opened the Quran. Now to land that on them and make them feel guilty, and that early Muslims are so good. That sheikh was talking to the people in his locality, and life was different then, and that was the right advice to give. But we have to kind of map that area now, and we have to look at it differently. So the advice has to be slightly different. The focus points have to be different. The priorities are different now. For instance, I believe there's a whole field now that we need to really look at, which is the spirituality of social media, or kind of how do we navigate that spiritually. Very important. It should be a part and parcel of tasawwuf. So we need many more kind of workshops that are basic, that are very basic, in the sense that they're not cluttered. They're not kind of full of jargon, but they get to the point, and you can just take it away and you can just do it. It's very easy to do, something really practical. So I hope, inshallah, we can start some of those soon, definitely. So yeah, that may not suit us, but the prophetic advice is universal for every time, and that's why the Prophet's advice is so simple. Would miracles of a sheikh be a good thing to make him your spiritual guide? Don't get me started, man. I'm going to tell you a story about it. I promise I'm going to finish on this because I have to eat dinner as well. I'm going to finish with this story. Sheikh Harputi, again, a come to Burda mentions. So there's a sheikh sitting there, and a man comes to him and he says, Sheikh, I know a wali. He says, really? He said, yeah, I know a wali. So the Sheikh must be thinking like, they say about a real man of God, a wali, a guardian, that a wali man lam ya'rif wilayat, a real man, person of God, and woman, by the way, including that, of God, is somebody who does not know that they're a person of God. Anyway, he says, what does he do? He says, who yamshi al ilma, he walks on water. He said, وَكَذَلِكَ samak, so do fish. He said, Shaykh huwa yatiru fi sama, he flies in the sky. He said, so do birds. He said, he travels from east to west fi khutwatin wahida, in one step. He said, وَكَذَلِكَ shaitan, so does the devil. He said, Shaykh, what is the sign of a wali then? He said, al-istiqama khairul karama or ainul karama. The only miracle you need to be worried about is istiqama, steadfastness, continuity, holy monotony. Holy monotony. You see, holy monotony is a wonderful statement, man. Holy monotony. Because that's what a religion is. We need holy monotony. How many times do we pray a day? 5. Does it change ever? No, every day it's monotonous. We repeat it. Repeat it. You see, and that's something very important in our religion that we've forgotten, that we assume doing new things will make us better. It won't. It's repeating the old things and making them better that makes us good people. The foundations are very strong. That's what our religion is about. Spirituality is not mystical. It's not interesting necessarily. It doesn't make you feel good. It's hard work, like I said. Inshallah, I'll finish on that note. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر. See everybody next week. وأتوب إليه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.